Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the week 4 or the last module of our discussions on textiles and allied practices, threads of visual exploration. So in this week or in this module, we will be talking about this idea of sustainability. In this week, we will be going through a lot on the production of textile, its impact on our lives. And when I say our lives, that means like in terms of the geological condition of the earth, as well as the social cultural conditions that we have, and then also in terms of the economic situations, and then what are the ways in which we can think that there can be a way in we can all support each other for continuing. So the textile industries, the way we see it today, the worldwide consumption, it is textile industries and the worldwide consumption, it always makes a huge deal of impact on the way in which the entire production of objects, those are created and consumed across the globe. So in some of the recent studies, we have found that at least 7% of all export goods have been textiles across the world. In the 2000s, we find that a huge amount of textiles were produced, circulated and exported from the countries in Asia. And then also we can see that there is a there is also an added sort of responsibility on the developing countries, because these countries function as the producers as well as the consumers. So this is something that also puts the situation of India in a particularly important place. And after 2000s, we find that with the neoliberal economy and also with this extended amount of global exchanges between different places, that China, India, then some of the places in South America, then also in Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia and Cambodia, they have emerged as some of the prime players in the textile industry. So a lot of manufacturing would be done under the umbrella of the international brands, which are probably situated in Europe or in the North Atlantic world, but then the manufacturing and then the entire packaging, everything is taken place in this so-called developing countries. So those issues that definitely makes the aspect of textiles impact on our lives very significant. And when we talk about this large textile industries, a lot of times we are not really addressing the unorganized handmade sectors of making textiles, which have thrived in this subcontinent, in India and the Indian subcontinent, for millennia. Now there are also certain things we can think that, I mean, textile is something as of necessity. So it is not just the wearable that we wear in our body, but it is also something that we see as an extension of architecture. So for example, when we think about tents, canopies and stuff like that, then there are also furnishing fabrics that we require in our homes, and to make an architecture livable, to make an architecture that is much more relatable to all of us. So those kind of sectors in which we require textiles apart from our body, but then also there is textile that is required in automobile industry, in healthcare and everywhere else. So with all those things, we can assume, at least we can predict one thing, that textile is definitely not going to be out of our economy and out of our social systems in the distant future. So this is a concern for us, and perhaps that is also a reason for us to think more about the sustainable textile making practices, because with mass production and mass consumption, we see that, I mean, the amount of textiles which are created annually and then the textiles which are discarded, so all those, they make a huge deal of impact on our lives in this planet. So those are the reasons thinking about sustainability, but also thinking about sustainability in a holistic manner, is very important at this moment. So I guess in this module, what we will do is we will have certain reflections on this idea of sustainability. So understanding sustainability and its relationship with textile making. So this is perhaps the overarching theme of this module, understanding this term, how sustainability is defined, its different kind of connotations, and then also its implications in the various sectors of human societies. And then we will also have a brief section where we will have interviews with practitioners, specialists on sustainable textile making practices and craft practices. In this section, we will see practitioners, then academicians, and so on. So we will see different aspects of textile making and how do they think that their practice may or may help us to understand how sustainability operates in our societies as well as in the hands-on practice of textile making. So those would be the overarching themes. We will be talking about them in this module. Now, the sustainability, when we talk about this concept, we will come to the definition of this term sustainability. But before that, one thing I must clarify, that sustainability, when we talk about it, it appears more relevant when we talk about the utilitarian items. So as part of this course, as part of Threads of Visual Exploration, we have looked into a lot of different kinds of materials, and textiles are not really seen as something exclusive. Textiles are seen in a network of different kind of objects and practices. Now, the idea of sustainability might differ for the kind of objects we look at. In one hand, when we looked into we tried blurring the boundaries between the so-called utilitarian and non-utilitarian items. So for example, the kind of objects which would be like miniature paintings, manuscript paintings, murals, and so on, which are understood as something that is non-utilitarian. They cannot be used the way we can use the objects of our daily need, for example textile. But then in one hand, when we tried to bridge this gap between the utilitarian and non-utilitarian items, but then when we come to the issues around sustainability, perhaps there we have to assert that sustainability, this idea of sustainability, perhaps work very differently in the utilitarian and the non-utilitarian items. So when we think about sustainability and sustainable development, there have been multiple theories about it, and this term sustainability has been highly contested, and that's because the definition of this term differs from one context to another. But then I will be looking mostly into some of the recent theorizations, and especially by Rebecca Rubens, and in which we find that sustainability or sustainable development has sort of been seen as synonymous. And in this case, we see that sustainable development or sustainability comes to signify a way of meeting the needs of our present, drawing on the past while being mindful of the future. Now, by this, what do I mean? So when we talk about sustainable development or sustainability, we assume that there is a kind of practice that has been there and that sort of already supported the human societies for some time, and at times we might require alterations in that, at times we might also require transformations in that, and at times we also might require to preserve certain aspects which have been there in these practices for quite some time. So sustainable development or sustainability might come to represent a way in which the current needs that we have in our human societies, we as individuals, we as collectives, the things or the objects or the kind of necessities that we have in our societies to live and to flourish. So those kind of needs need to be met, and that is part of like the craft making process and different kind of object making practices, industries, everything, those are definitely focused on that. Now, to meet the needs of the present, we see that there are always certain issues we can think about, that how the meeting the needs of the present can also result in having different kinds of impact on the environment. So for that reason, it is very important for us to learn from the past and think about what kind of practices that have survived the test of time basically, and then the kind of practices that have survived and that had showed us a way in which the society, nature and different kinds of objects can coexist peacefully and simultaneously. So this is something that we can learn from the past, and while mindful about the future is something to think about what are our responsibilities towards the future generations, what are our responsibilities to preserve certain aspects of the nature which are already nourishing us and our lives. So this is something that we can think about as a definition of sustainability, that a way of meeting the needs of the present and drawing on the past, and while being mindful of the future. Now, in the idea of sustainability, we do find that a lot of times ecology and environment, they certainly come as a very important aspect of them. And that's because when we talk about sustainability, one of our prime concerns is to think about the balance between human lives and then the lives which are outside of urbanization and rural economy, and also the lives which are not always inhabited by human presence. So those kind of presence, I mean those kind of balance we usually talk about when we talk about sustainability. So ecology and environment clearly play a very important role in terms of understanding sustainability. Now, the other issue we can also think about is the ethical consumption. Now, ethics is something we can think in terms of that there are many different ways in which we understand ethics, and it also, like, I mean, its parameters might shift in terms of how the subject position of the thinker is. But some of the things we might also kind of agree that an ethical consumption or a way of ethically producing and consuming things can be a way of mindfully doing things, consciously doing things, being aware of what are the consequences of the things that we do, what are the consequences of the steps we take. So this is again that we can see in a way that thinking about sustainability and sustainable development is a very complex way of engaging with the notion of time, in which we are being in the present but thinking about drawing from the past, but then thinking also about the future. So it's a complex way of operating in a society while being thoughtful about temporalities. So this is one way of perhaps understanding sustainability that we will see. And this is, as I have already mentioned, that even though the ecology and environment are some of the themes or the concepts that we find them to be prioritized when we talk about sustainability, but there are also other aspects in which we do find that those things which can be much more useful to sort of think about sustainability. Now, the age we live in today, it is also understood as Anthropocene, in which we see that the human activities are shaping the geological future of the planet in a way that which was probably not been considered 300 or 400 years from today. So this is definitely it's a way of understanding that how some kind of human activities, they have their long-term impact on the geological future of the planet. Now, one of the first thing that perhaps that comes to our mind is to think about the industrial revolution that existed from mid 18th century to the mid 19th century. During this time, what we find that there was a tremendous focus in Western Europe about expansion of making products using different kind of sources of energy. And sometimes we find that there are renewable sources of energy, but then there are also sources which cannot be renewed, for example fuel, for example coal, and etc. So those kind of things, definitely we do find that how using such kind of energy which were prioritized during the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, it would have a long time impact on the way in which our societies function. Now, what we also find that with the this conditions for industrial revolution, I mean, if we think about the industrial revolution to be this so-called culprit, which sort of created this concerns about keeping a balance between human societies and nature, but then the conditions for this industrial revolutions, we see that that was perhaps building up for centuries in Western Europe, which eventually culminated into this industrial revolution in the late 18th century. Now, this is something we certainly see that, I mean, even though this conditions have existed, but then why this time period, what we understand in terms of industrial revolution is important, is because we find that extraction of the natural resources, the way it had been done during this time, it was quite significant. This extraction of the resources, if we think about the use of coal and etc., so the way it was done in a mass scale, it was perhaps not been done like that in the past, and that is the reason there was a concern in terms of understanding that what has happened and then what is coming next. Now, the image that we have on screen, and this shows the Britain's Great Exhibition or the Great Exposition in 1851. It was right after we start seeing the large scale impacts of the industrial revolution in Britain and different parts of Western Europe. So during this time we had this exhibition, which is also known as this exhibition, in which a lot of the colonized countries have were represented, and it was an exhibition or an exposition in which we find that a lot of art objects, craft objects from the Indian subcontinent had also been exhibited, and eventually those will end up in the South Kensington Museum, which later came to be known as the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Now, the structure that we see here, this is called this Crystal Palace, this exhibition venue, and the structure was built with steel and glass, the kind of material which was definitely not been produced in a large scale before this time. So for that reason, the structure, which had this reflective surface and also this transparent walls for the use of glass, we find that the structure came to be known as Crystal Palace, and then the structure also came to be considered as a wondrous architectural structure, and that's because we find that the kind of objects or the kind of materials which were used, that those were certainly not been seen before. So steel, it is also industrially produced. The way steel is made, we find that this is lightweight, at the same time it is durable. Also, the way in which we find that the iron can gather rust, the steel does not. So there are many different ways in which steel was found as a material which was of high benefit, and that is the reason we find that for its durability and the lightweight character, it was incorporated in different kind of practices. For example, in the buildings, in architecture, and both like permanent and temporary architectural structures, as well as different kinds of objects that we would use for daily needs. For example, in the later times in the 19th century, we find that, I mean, how the household items would also incorporate steel. Then in the early 20th century, we will find that the bicycles and everything else, those will also incorporate the steel pipes and etc. So that is how we find that this particularly relevant material, which was industrially produced steel, that is made from the iron ore, that became significant. And at the same time, making glasses in the industrial scale, this massive production also resulted in covering the entire structure with only steel structures and the steel armature and with glass. So this is something we find that how this entire crystal palace came to signify the triumph of the industrial revolution. And the triumph of the industrial revolution, we think that, I mean, this is also something that is it comes at the price of thinking about our concerns in sustainability. Now, before this time, if we think about that, I mean, what kind of value system or the production chain had survived, we find that before the industrial revolutions, there have been self-sustaining systems. And perhaps there are some of the examples one can produce in terms of the rural economical sectors, in which we find that the surplus production, that if in a society there are producers like farmers, and then there are also producers such as the artisans, so different kind of craft objects which are used for daily needs. And then the craft makers would also include textile makers. So there is a way in which we can see that how one community can also support the other, and that is how the entire ecosystem of a particular region or a village or a community can grow. So this is something we find. And then the surplus production, if we think about it, surplus production in terms of the agricultural production as well as the artisanal production can be used for trading purposes. And trading is also something, at times, if we find that particular kind of items of need are not found in a particular place, then trading also becomes useful in that sense. So the surplus items are usually being traded for these purposes. So we find that the kind of objects which are produced for the communities, and then also those are the surplus production which can be sent for other places to be traded. So those definitely participated in this complex value chains, and textile being one of such items, we find that it had very frequently participated in this value chains, not only between regions but also across the oceans. And we are talking about in the early modern period or even before that. So this is something we find that how this kind of production would enable a kind of system which enables long-term communication between communities, and that is how one community gets to know another, but also at the same time it opens up avenues for circulation of knowledge, circulation of value, at the same time also circulation of different skill set. So this is what we find, that how the economy or like, I mean, the systems of productions have survived for the longest period of time. And in terms of industrial revolution, what we find that there are concentrated areas or factories or setups which would have specialized mechanism or techniques which would definitely lower the time for which is required for making particular kind of production. So that would certainly add to making things much more in a more timely, efficient manner. But then it would also result in people who are engaged in this kind of production to do one particular kind of job. So we find that in the industrial setup, a lot of times which had started during this industrial revolution, and similar kind of setup we still find them today, in which we see that in various parts of a factory in which textiles are produced. I mean, if I take textiles for example, we find that in which there are the workers, they usually take care of one particular thing perhaps for an extended period of time. So if someone is sewing something, so they would be sewing only one part of the fabric, and that is something they would continue to do for the entire time period until the consignment is finished. So if someone is supposed to make particular kind of amendments and or add the tags in the textiles, so they would probably go do that for the entire time period. So in this sense, what happens is the ways in which perhaps one weaver can think about, I mean, if we imagine that, I mean, the weaver is not just someone who sits in the loom and weaves, but they are also involved in certain to certain extent in spinning the yarn, and then laying this out, making the arrangement, and then doing all the preparations before putting the yarn in the loom, and then also finishing the fabric, and then thinking in terms of that what comes after finishing the fabric. So all these things before it reaches the market, there are a lot of different kind of things that the weaver can do, and this diversification is very important when we think about the modes of working. When there is this the scopes of learning gets less and less, so in that sense that also affects not only our skill set but also our mental and physical well-being. So this is something we find that how this kind of issues can come back to us, and so thinking about industrial revolution, that if extraction of resources, if we start with that idea that extraction of resources that had happened during the industrial revolution, and it had a ecological impact on the planet, and then thinking about that how that affected sustainability, but then we find that, I mean, the modes in which the workers may work in a factory, it not only just a concern about the ecological factors or the extraction of resources, but it is also something to do with the conditions of human lives, what we probably do not see the similar manner if we think about the handmade or the unorganized sectors of textile making. So these are some of the concerns we can think, and this kind of concerns also make us aware that the idea of sustainability is perhaps not just about ecology and environment, but it has a larger impact on our lives and well-being. Now, the concerns of sustainability, perhaps it has also deeper roots in the colonialism that we evidenced in across the world, and mostly in the developing countries, by the countries from Western Europe in the 18th and in the 19th century, at least until the mid 20th century as well. So in this case, what happens, we find that in terms of colonization, we see that there is, if we take the example of Britain, we find that Britain had moved from using wood as a material for fuel, for different kind of energy generation, to coal during the Industrial Revolution, and then the labor relations for that had also started changing because of making things on a mass scale. We need one certainly require a lot of more people, but then the people, what we think about in terms of in this industrial setup, we are thinking about people who are not really equipped to do different kinds of work or diversify their skill set or the thinking abilities. So that is what we find, that how the colonizer countries, they have become more and more interested in slave trade. And then, like, I mean, slave trade, and that also sort of enabled having cheap labor in the industrial setups or the setups in which agriculture would be done. For example, in the Americas, we find that the production of cotton, production of sugar, also like sugar in other parts of the globe as well. So those are intrinsically connected to slave trade and endangered labor. So this is something we find, that how industrialization and colonization, both of these things are very integrally connected, because industrialization created the need for colonization, that this production in the mass scale, and then acquiring products or acquiring raw material at a really cheap price, and then having a cheap labor in action, all of those required the Western European countries to have control over the other places, which are the places in the non-European countries, and that sort of definitely added to the ways in which we see the exploitation of the labor, the exploitation of rural economies that had contributed to. Now, in the 1850s, we find that Manchester in Britain, it flourished as this town where textile making in the cotton mills had peaked, and then the peaking of the textile making or the mill made textile making, we find that to be there in Britain. It peaked around 1912, and right after that, the World War I, that definitely destabilized the economy, that definitely destabilized the myth of progress. And that is something perhaps we can also think about, how that made us think about what is sustainable, what is not. Perhaps a dramatic climax like that, that also made us think about what are the ways further. So we will continue discussing these ideas about sustainability in the lecture, in the next lecture. Thank you.